My girlfriend said, "It's not my fault you can't keep up," after maxing out my credit card. I didn't say a word, but what she got in the mail 2 weeks later made her panic. I, 29M, thought I knew who my girlfriend was until the day she maxed out my credit card and delivered the most devastating line I'd ever heard. What happened next changed everything between us forever. It started on a Tuesday morning when I checked my banking app during my coffee break. The notification made my blood run cold. My credit card was completely maxed out at $15,000. My hands shook as I scrolled through the charges. Designer handbags, expensive jewelry, luxury spa treatments, high-end restaurants I'd never been to. All within the past week. I called my girlfriend immediately, my voice barely steady as I asked her about the charges. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she laughed, actually laughed, and told me she'd been treating herself and her friends to some much-needed retail therapy. When I explained that this was money I'd been saving for months to help with my father's medical bills, her tone shifted to annoyed impatience. She reminded me that I'd given her access to my card for emergencies, and apparently her definition of emergency was vastly different from mine. When I pressed her about why she hadn't asked first, she delivered the line that would haunt me for weeks. "It's not my fault you can't keep up with my lifestyle." The words hit me like a physical blow. We'd been together for 2 years, and I'd always known she had expensive tastes, but I thought she understood my financial situation. I worked 2 jobs to make ends meet while putting myself through graduate school. Every dollar mattered to me, and she knew it. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes after that call, staring at the charges on my phone. The casual cruelty in her voice kept replaying in my mind. She hadn't just stolen from me. She'd made it clear that she thought I was inadequate for not being able to fund her whims. That night, when I got home to our shared apartment, she was getting ready to go out with friends. She looked stunning in a new dress that I now realized I'd unknowingly paid for. When I tried to discuss the situation calmly, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her manicured hand. She told me to stop being dramatic and that I should be grateful she was still with someone who couldn't afford to spoil her properly. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to her breathe beside me, wondering how I'd been so blind to who she really was. The woman I'd planned to propose to had just revealed herself to be someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my bank and reported the unauthorized charges, explaining that someone had used my card without permission. The representative was sympathetic and assured me they would investigate. Then I called my credit card company and did the same thing. But that was just the beginning. I spent the next few days quietly gathering evidence. I screenshotted text messages where she bragged to her friends about her shopping spree, using my phone when she'd left it unlocked. I documented every purchase, every location, every detail. I even found receipts in her purse where she'd written my name on the customer copy, clearly establishing that she'd been using my card. She had no idea what was coming. I also started making other arrangements. I contacted my landlord and explained that I'd be breaking the lease due to financial fraud committed by my roommate. Given the circumstances and my clean rental history, he agreed to let me out of the lease with minimal penalty. I quietly started looking for a new place and arranged to have my belongings moved the following weekend when she'd be out of town visiting her sister. The credit card company called me back within 3 days. They'd reviewed the charges and determined them to be fraudulent since they were made without my knowledge or consent. They would be reversing all charges and issuing me a new card. More importantly, they would be filing a report with local authorities about the unauthorized use. That's when things got interesting. I received a call from a detective who wanted to discuss the fraud case. I met with him and provided all my documentation. He explained that credit card fraud was a serious crime, especially when it involved someone close to the victim who had gained access through trust and then exceeded any reasonable interpretation of that access. My girlfriend still had no idea any of this was happening. She continued spending money, thankfully now her own, and treating me like an ATM that had temporarily malfunctioned. She even had the audacity to suggest I should get a higher credit limit so this wouldn't happen again. 2 weeks after that devastating phone call, everything came to a head. I was at work when she called me, her voice high-pitched and panicked. She'd received a letter in the mail that morning, a formal notice that she was being investigated for credit card fraud and would need to appear in court. I let her explain the entire situation to me as if I knew nothing about it. listening to her voice crack as she read portions of the legal document. She couldn't understand how this had happened. She insisted she'd done nothing wrong, that I'd given her permission to use the card. I asked her if she remembered what she'd said to me about not being able to keep up with her lifestyle. The line went quiet for a long moment before she stammered that she'd been upset and hadn't meant it that way. But we both knew she had meant it exactly that way. When I got home that evening, she was waiting for me with tears in her eyes and a completely different attitude. She apologized profusely, claiming she'd never meant to hurt me and that she'd just gotten carried away. She promised to pay back every penny, though we both knew she didn't have that kind of money. I sat down across from her and calmly explained what had happened over the past 2 weeks. I told her about the fraud investigation, about the evidence I'd gathered, about the fact that the charges had been reversed and she would now be held legally accountable for them. Her face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally terror as the reality of her situation sank in. She accused me of betraying her, of being vindictive and cruel. She couldn't believe I would involve the police in what she called a relationship issue. I reminded her that $15,000 in unauthorized charges wasn't a relationship issue, it was a crime. I also pointed out that she'd had every opportunity to make this right before it reached this point, but instead she'd chosen to double down on her entitled attitude. The next few days were a whirlwind. She tried everything: tears, anger, bargaining, threats. She contacted mutual friends to try to turn them against me, painting herself as the victim of my vindictive nature. Most of them, however, were appalled when they learned what she'd actually done. Her parents even called me, initially angry about the legal trouble their daughter was facing. But after I calmly explained the situation and offered to show them the evidence, their tune changed dramatically. Her father actually apologized to me and said he was ashamed of his daughter's behavior. Update 1. The court date arrived faster than either of us expected. I'd moved out of our apartment the weekend before, as planned, leaving only a note explaining that I couldn't continue living with someone who had so little respect for me or my financial situation. She'd been trying to reach me constantly, alternating between apologies and accusations. Her lawyer had apparently advised her to try to reach a settlement, but there was nothing to settle. The credit card company was pursuing their own case regardless of what I wanted. The day before court, she showed up at my new apartment somehow, having gotten my address from a mutual friend. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. She begged me to drop the charges, promising she'd pay everything back and that she'd learned her lesson. I explained to her that I couldn't drop charges I hadn't filed. The credit card company had initiated this action based on their investigation. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't make it go away now. She broke down completely then, sobbing about how this would ruin her career prospects and her future. I felt a flicker of the sympathy I'd once felt for her, but then I remembered her words about my inability to keep up with her lifestyle, and the feeling passed. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor had everything I'd provided plus additional evidence from the credit card company's investigation. Security footage from stores, signed receipts, even social media posts where she'd bragged about her expensive purchases. Her lawyer tried to argue that there had been implied consent since we were in a relationship and she'd used the card before, but the prosecution easily demonstrated that previous small purchases for shared expenses were vastly different from a $15,000 solo shopping spree. The judge was not sympathetic to her case. He pointed out that regardless of the relationship, exceeding any reasonable interpretation of consent and then showing no remorse when confronted constituted clear intent to defraud. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended pending completion of community service, 3 years probation, and full restitution to the credit card company. She also had to attend financial responsibility classes and could not obtain any credit cards during her probation period. Update 2. 6 months have passed since the court date, and my life has completely transformed. The weight of that toxic relationship is gone, and I can finally see how much it was holding me back. I used the money that was returned to me to help with my father's medical bills as originally planned. His treatment has been successful, and he's now in remission. When I told him about everything that had happened, he said he'd never liked my ex-girlfriend anyway and was proud of me for standing up for myself. I finished my graduate degree with a 3.9 GPA, no longer distracted by constant financial stress and relationship drama. I've been offered a position at a prestigious firm that comes with a significant salary increase. My ex-girlfriend contacted me once during this period, about 3 months after the court date. She'd apparently been fired from her job when her employer learned about the conviction, something about working in financial services requiring a clean criminal record. She wanted to know if I would provide a character reference for her job search. I declined politely but firmly. I wished her well in turning her life around, but explained that I couldn't in good conscience recommend someone who had defrauded me to a potential employer. I heard through mutual friends that she'd eventually found work in retail and was living with her parents while completing her community service. Some friends suggested I should feel bad about how her life had turned out, but I didn't. She'd made her choices, and I'd simply refused to enable them. The most surprising development came just last month. I ran into her at a coffee shop near my old neighborhood. She looked different, humbler somehow, less polished, but more genuine than I remembered. She approached me hesitantly and asked if we could talk for a few minutes. I agreed, curious about what she might say. She apologized, really apologized, for the first time since this whole ordeal began. She admitted that she'd been living beyond her means for years and had convinced herself that she deserved expensive things regardless of who paid for them. The legal consequences and their aftermath had forced her to confront some hard truths about herself. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to minimize what she'd done. She simply acknowledged that her actions had been wrong and thanked me for not enabling her behavior any further, even though it had been painful at the time. I accepted her apology and genuinely wished her well. There was no romantic reconciliation. Too much had happened for that, but I felt closure in a way I hadn't expected. As I walked away from that coffee shop, I realized that the entire experience, as painful as it had ultimately been a gift. It had shown me my own worth and taught me that love should never come at the cost of self-respect. I'm dating someone new now, a fellow graduate student who insists on splitting every check and has never once made me feel inadequate about my financial situation. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how severely I handled the situation with my ex. The answer is no. She'd made it clear that she saw me as nothing more than a source of funding for her lifestyle. By taking legal action, I not only protected myself, but potentially prevented her from doing the same thing to someone else. The woman who told me it wasn't her fault I couldn't keep up had learned, in the most definitive way possible, that actions have consequences. And I'd learned that I was worth far more than I'd ever given myself credit for. Looking back, that devastating Tuesday morning phone call had been the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to me. Sometimes the most painful wake-up calls are exactly what we need to change our lives for the better.